This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. 10 Democratic presidential hopefuls took to the stage in New York City Wednesday night for a climate town hall hosted by CNN. The event was held less than 2 weeks after the Democratic National Committee rejected a resolution that would have allowed candidates to participate in a debate focused on the climate crisis. For months, the Sunrise Movement and other environmental groups pushed the DNC to hold a climate debate, but the party refused.
At Wednesday's event, each candidate appeared on stage alone and took questions from CNN hosts and the audience. Several candidates, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, voiced their support for the Green New Deal.
It's about a new deal for people who work. It's about justice for people whose communities have been destroyed. It's about racial justice on environmental issues. It's about worker justice.
At the CNN Climate Town Hall, Senator Bernie Sanders called for the nation to rethink its spending priorities.
Maybe, just maybe, instead of spending $1.5 trillion every single year on weapons of destruction designed to kill each other, maybe we pool those resources and we work together against our common enemy, which is climate change.
Just hours before the town hall, The Intercept reported former Vice President Joe Biden was planning to attend a high-dollar fundraiser tonight in New York by the founder of a fossil fuel company. During the town hall, Isaac Larkin, a 27-year-old PhD candidate at Northwestern, asked Biden about this.
I know that you signed the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge, but I have to ask, how can we trust you to hold these corporations and executives accountable for their crimes against humanity when we know that tomorrow you are holding a high-dollar fundraiser hosted by Andrew Goldman, a fossil fuel executive?
He is not a fossil fuel executive, I'm told. He is not a fossil fuel executive. And the fact of the matter is that what we talk about is, what are we going to do about those corporations? What have we done? And everywhere along the way, for example, I've argued and pushed for us suing those executives who are engaged in pollution, those companies who are engaged in pollution. I've never walked away from that.
Later in the town hall, CNN host Anderson Cooper brought up the same issue.
Mr. Vice President, Isaac earlier mentioned that the fundraiser, I do want to clarify, Andrew Goldman, the guy who's one of the co-sponsors of the fundraiser, he had a company he was co-founder of a company called Western LNG. He currently doesn't have day-to-day responsibilities. So
what I was told by my staff is that he did not have any responsibility relating to the company. He was not on the board. He was not involved at all in the operation of the company at all. But if that turns out to be true, then I will not in any way accept his help. But my point of the fact is that the point I was told by my staff, and we check every single contribution. That's why we don't list them immediately. We go through every contribution to make sure that we are not accepting money from people we said we wouldn't or we shouldn't.
We're joined now by three guests. Washington, D.C., Mustafa Ali is with us, the former head of the Environmental Justice Program at the EPA. That's right, the Environmental Protection Agency. He quit under President Trump. He's vice president now of the National Wildlife Federation. In Minneapolis, Mattias Lehman is with us, the digital director of the Sunrise Movement. And here in New York, Kate Aronoff, fellow at the Type Media Center, contributing writer to The Intercept, Guardian, and Jacobin. Kate Aronoff, let's begin with you. Soon after Joe Biden came onto the set and started answering questions, he was asked about this fundraiser he is supposed to be holding tonight here in New York that is hosted by Andrew Goldman. Can you talk more about this, what The Intercept revealed right before and then he was questioned about?
Yeah, so as my colleague Kayla Lacey at The Intercept reported shortly before the debate, as it seems like Joe Biden may not have been briefed on before he took the stage, he is scheduled to go to a fundraiser tonight with Andrew Goldman, who is the co-founder of a company called Western LNG. And so what the debate ended up being about last night, and that Anderson Cooper ended up talking about, was whether or not Andrew Goldman is technically in the management of this company.
In the day-to-day operations.
In the day-to-day operations. And so there was some back and forth online, and at the end, Anderson Cooper sort of corrected, but, as Splinter dug up, and as, I think my colleagues at The Intercept really sort of affirmed, Andrew Goldman is a co-founder of this company. Just last year, in a filing in Canada, he was listed as among the senior management of the company. I think it would be very hard to argue that Andrew Goldman is not very well bound up in the natural gas industry.
And yet, Joe Biden has taken the no fossil fuel pledge. What does that mean, and what was your assessment of last night?
Yeah, so he's taken the no fossil fuel pledge, and what groups like Oil Change International and the Sunrise Movement had said, especially Oil Change International, is that, while technically, while Andrew Goldman does not sit on the board, is not in the SEC filings of Western LNG as a fossil fuel executive, going to a fundraiser with him certainly violates the spirit of the no fossil fuel pledge. And so I think, as long as Joe Biden is splitting hairs about exactly how bound up Andrew Goldman is with the fossil fuel industry, I think, that's pretty clear that this violates the spirit of this pledge.
And Mattias Lehman, you're with the Sunrise Movement, which of course has been critical in pushing for a discussion of the climate crisis. And a number of people from the Sunrise Movement, students, asked questions at the town hall last night. Your response to the town hall, and what you think the most crucial things are that came out of the discussion.
Yeah, so we see this as a pretty big win for us. It's not the win we wanted, obviously. It's not a climate debate. And part of that is evident if you look at how the event was hosted. It actually doesn't go through the paywall for live TV like debates do. So lots of people couldn't watch it because they don't have access to, say, a cable network provider. But this is the most we've ever talked about climate change on American TV for years, so just ever. We had about 6 minutes and 23 seconds in 2018, which is less than the royal wedding got. We just got 7 hours in a row, every major presidential candidate talking about this issue. So we're super excited about what this means and what comes next. But our big takeaway is that when you look at the different candidates on stage, there's room to look at the differences between those candidates, not just in what plans they're proposing, but as Buttigieg noted, also just in how they're going to prioritize pushing them forwards. And going back to your Joe Biden point, when we look at prioritization and how we trust candidates to act on climate change, going to a fundraiser the next day with a co-founder of a fossil fuel company is not a good look.
Mustafa Ali, you are formerly with the EPA. People might refer to the EPA as the EPA that once was, but you quit under President Trump. You're deeply involved in the environmental justice movement, now Vice President of the National Wildlife Federation. Can you talk about what was raised, and particularly talk about how the candidates diverged on how they'll deal with the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as was stated before, it was a good start, but there were a number of areas that we really need to hear much more about. And especially, so let me start off with saying that, in the first presidential debate that happened, it was like 7,200 seconds, and the words environmental justice were never mentioned the first time. The one that we had last night in the town hall, thankfully, there were a handful of candidates who actually said the words and began to play with the surface of what's going on in frontline communities. So we had some of the basics that were talked about. There was that conversation around carbon tax or cap and trade. And for frontline communities, cap and trade is definitely an issue that brings up some great concerns around hot spots. I also appreciated what we heard from Senator Sanders and Senator Warren around a conversation about a just transition, about making sure that those workers who have been working in dirty industries that there's a pathway forward and that it doesn't have to be a confrontational situation. When we look at the conversations that Mayor Castro had, or former Secretary Castro had, excuse me, around the need for civil rights legislation to be a part of this process is incredibly important as well, because what we've had on the books to date has not been strong enough to actually protect our most vulnerable communities. When you look at the conversations that Mayor Buttigieg had around the Department of Defense and the military playing a much stronger role in this process, that's incredibly important also, because the military in the past has not been as transparent with some of the impacts that they've had in communities, but they also understand, and they put out numerous reports about the impacts from climate change and how they need to be better preparing for what's going to happen. So, you know, there were a number of very positive things that were shared, actions that were talked about, but there was not enough conversation about how frontline communities are actually being impacted in a very in-depthful way. And the other thing, Amy, that I'll close with is that I'm not sure, and I've had conversations with every one of those candidates, some more in-depth than others, that folks are really getting what is being said in the IPCC report and the National Climate Assessment, because if we've had this situation where we literally have a country, the Bahamas, that has literally been devastated, almost wiped off the map, and people are still having conversations around 2050 and 2045 as dates that, you know, are sort of their benchmarks. And we know that there's 11 years and a few months left before we hit that tipping point. I'm very concerned that folks are not as focused and as serious about pushing a progressive agenda that will help to actually protect our entire planet, but especially our country.
We continue to cover Wednesday's climate crisis town hall. We turn to Senator Bernie Sanders being questioned by CNN's Anderson Cooper.
Would you guarantee to the American public tonight that the responsibility for $16.3 trillion, which is a massive amount of money, wouldn't end up on taxpayers' shoulders?
Well, it'll end up on some taxpayers' shoulders. If you are in the fossil fuel industry, you're going to be paying more in taxes, that's for sure. Yeah. And I happen to believe in general that at a time when we have massive levels of income and wealth inequality, where the richest 3 people in this country own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, where major profitable corporations like Amazon, who made over $10 billion in profits last year, didn't pay a nickel in taxes. Am I going to guarantee Jeff Bezos he's not going to be paying more in taxes? No, I won't.
That's Bernie Sanders. Again, we're joined by Kate Aronoff of The Intercept and Jacobin, Mustafa Ali, former EPA official, and Mattias Lehman from St. Paul of the Sunrise Movement. So there you have Bernie Sanders talking about whether he'd increase taxes. And before that, we played the clip of Sanders talking about, instead of spending $1.5 trillion on weapons of mass destruction, we work together against our common enemy, which is climate change. Your response, Kate Aronoff?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Sanders is rightly pointing out here is that we spend money in a lot of wrong places, right? We spend so much money on fossil fuel subsidies, on the military, and the question that's been brought up frequently in response to the Green New Deal, how will you pay for this? These plans are so expensive, really don't take into account either that fact that we're spending money in these places we just don't need to be spending money on and are actually actively harmful, and the fact that, you know, what happens if we don't take on this crisis at the scale it demands, right? As you know, Sanders points out in his Green New Deal plan,
$16 trillion.
His $16.3 trillion Green New Deal plan. There are, you know, many, many trillions of dollars to be lost if we let this crisis sort of go unabated. And so I think, you know, what he's rightly pointing out here is that, as well as the fact that, you know, there is not sort of a shortage of funds available to fund this transition, right? Both, you know, we have these sort of wrong priorities that the U.S. government is spending money on, and the fact that, you know, we just can afford this transition very simply. There's no sort of constraint on the amount of money we have. There's a constraint on the amount of resources we have, but that is the main concern, and there should be no expense spared in really, you know, going forward full ahead with this transition.
Well, let's turn to an audience member questioning Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Bernie Sanders has endorsed the idea of the public ownership of utilities, arguing that we can't adequately solve this crisis without removing the profit motive from the distribution of essential needs like energy. As president, would you be willing to call out capitalism in this way and advocate for the public ownership of our utilities?
Gosh, I'm not sure that that's what gets you to the solution. I'm perfectly willing to take on giant corporations. I think I've been known to do that once or twice. But for me, I think the way we get there is we just say, sorry guys, but by 2035, you're done. You're not going to be using any more carbon-based fuels. That gets us to the right place. And if somebody wants to make a profit from building better solar panels and generating better battery storage, I'm not opposed to that. What I'm opposed to is when they do it in a way that hurts everybody else. You shouldn't be able to externalize these costs. That's the problem with fossil fuels right now. I think that the best way we go forward here is we open up the opportunities. We open up the possibilities. We invest in the science. We invest in the manufacturing. We invest in the pieces that let us build a future together going forward. But, I just want to be clear. We got to have tough rules that we are willing to enforce. And that means we have got to be willing to fight back against these giant industries. And that's where the whole thing starts for me. We put them on their back foot, then we have a real chance to make the changes we need to make.
So that's Senator Elizabeth Warren responding to a question by a writer and climate organizer from Brooklyn, Robert Wood, at the Climate Crisis Town Hall Wednesday night. So, Kate, could you respond to Warren's position on the public ownership of utilities and Sanders' position, and also the fact that ahead of this town hall, Greenpeace ranked all the candidates, and Sanders came first, followed by Warren. Do you agree with that assessment, and do you think that the town hall discussion confirmed that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think what, last night really confirmed is, if it, weren't pretty obvious before, is that Sanders and Warren really are the top climate candidates in this race. They have the most serious plans for dealing with this problem. They also, just seem more comfortable talking about it than basically anyone else on stage. And so, that moment sort of talking about public ownership is really interesting because both Sanders and Warren's plans are hugely ambitious. And I think it illustrates a sort of key difference between them, right? Sanders' plan calls for massively expanding public ownership of energy, which is, of course, already pretty widespread in the U.S. We already have a lot of public utilities here. And sort of what he identifies is the fact that, having these utilities which can spend, massive amounts of money sort of polluting the political system, as they do frequently, being able to, extract profits instead of investing in things like safety and infrastructure and renewables, that is, a challenge to this transition. Whereas I think Warren, and what she sort of articulates here, is that she wants to set a sort of level playing field. She wants to, set a strong set of rules and regulations in which these companies can operate. And I think the problem, which I would argue with what she said, is that it's not just that these companies are doing harm because they're allowed to create externalities in the world that aren't being taxed properly, or that there aren't the right rules and regulations in place. It's that they have a business model that actually is incompatible with solving this crisis. Their whole business model is to find and dig up and sell more fossil fuels. And there is no meaningful evidence that they're about to change that. And so, I think that is a big sort of question for every candidate in this race, is what is the future of the fossil fuel industry? And I think, leaving a public option essentially off the table, either for utilities or fossil fuel companies, I don't think is sort of an option we have. And I think what Sanders' plan does is create a stick, really, for utilities to say that, we can bring you under public ownership. There are other ways of doing this that don't involve your profit motive. And so I think Sanders rightly kind of raises that.
I want to turn to Mattias Lehman and ask you about Senator Kamala Harris, who said she'd do away with the Senate filibuster if Republicans fail to work with Democrats in passing the Green New Deal.
On the issue of this climate crisis, I'm going to tell you, I strongly believe this is a fight against powerful interests. And leaders need to lead. So lead, follow, or get out the way. And get out the way starting with Donald Trump. So yeah, we need to work across the aisle. But I'm going to tell you, I've been there now 2 years and some months. I'm seeing no evidence of it. I'm seeing, I kid you guys not. In our United States Congress, I was part of a committee hearing during which the underlying premise of the hearing was to debate whether science should be the basis of public policy. This on a matter that is about an existential threat to who we are as human beings. So again, back to the United States Congress, here's my point. If they fail to act as President of the United States, I am prepared to get rid of the filibuster to pass a Green New Deal.
Kamala Harris at last night's climate crisis town hall in the midst of Hurricane Dorian barreling through the Caribbean, decimating the Bahamas, making its way now to the Carolinas. Mattias Lehman, if you can respond to what she said. And also, Senator Harris, among other people, did talk about environmental justice. Can you talk about this issue, what it means, and the issue of environmental racism?
Sure. So on the filibuster, simple answer, this is just important, yes. If you look at some of the opposition, we're talking about people like James Inhofe, who brought a snowball into Congress to say global warming wasn't happening. And even going back to your question about regulation, what it means to be tough on fossil fuel companies means having some sort of leverage. And like, we've had all the regulations we've wanted on housing, did not stop redlining from discriminating against African Americans. We have regulations on healthcare, does not stop people from going into bankruptcy because of their medical debt. We had regulations on financial speculation, did not stop the 2008 recession, which was caused by rampant speculation. So regulation is one part of a toolkit, but that toolkit really only matters if there is a credible threat of following up on it. And so I think when you look at energy companies, we don't have a credible alternative. We can't say, oh, I don't want to put gas in my car. I'm going to go to the solar car industry, right? That doesn't exist. And so we need these alternatives separated from profit in a lot of ways for us to be able to do that. We need some leverage against fossil fuel companies coming from our government, and it needs to be very strong leverage. And so I think that's like a fundamental point. But also, what you're saying about Kamala Harris is super important. I grew up in a heavily polluted minority community. I have asthma. This is a reality for a lot of people of color, for a lot of poor people. They bear the brunt of the beginnings of what climate change is bringing. In the Bahamas, we've seen mass devastation. And like you said, we can't wait for 2045 to prevent basically the death and destruction and the genocide of the Bahamian people because we won't act. That's ridiculous. And there's so many communities facing things like that right now. The refugees coming up from Honduras and from Central and South America as a whole up to our border right now, that is a climate crisis. We are letting these people die. We are letting these people die in concentration camps because we're not willing to act on climate change. That is just wrong. And I really have to wonder how much less willing we would be able to tolerate this death if we were talking about white people and not people of color. If we were talking about people who have a more white nationalist orientation don't care about and don't think about. So I think when we look at climate change, racial justice and environmental justice has to be at the forefront of everything we're thinking about and everything we're doing, because we can't just abandon the global South. We can't just abandon minorities and poor people and sort of run to the hills and save a fragment of humanity. This is a fight for the future of our species and the future of our planet, and we have to all be in here together, and we have to take into consideration everyone, not just a select few.
Well, another issue that was quite contentious during the town hall was nuclear power as part of any kind of climate crisis program. Senator Cory Booker defended the use of nuclear power.
My plan says that we need to be at a zero carbon electricity by 2030. That's 10 years from the time that I will win the presidency of the United States of America. And right now, nuclear is more than 50% of our non-carbon causing energy. So people who think that we can get there without nuclear being part of the blend just aren't looking at the facts. Where the science is going is, to me, at first it sounded like science fiction. We're talking about historic plants, but where the science has gone right now is new nuclear actually portends of exciting things where you have no risk of the kind of meltdowns we're seeing, where they eat spent fuel rods. We actually can go to the kind of innovations that make nuclear safer or safe.
So, Mustafa Ali, that's New Jersey Senator Cory Booker. Meanwhile, Senator Sanders came out very clearly against nuclear energy. Your response?
Well, let me start by saying, that Senator Booker has one of the strongest environmental justice plans that's out there. A number of the candidates have actually introduced plans or built language into it. And also, Senator Booker's actually spent time in frontline communities in a significant way listening. So I give him kudos for that. But we also have some real concerns when it comes to nuclear and nuclear waste. Indigenous brothers and sisters have been dealing with uranium tillings for years and the exposure that's in that space. We also know people talk about Yucca Mountain, but the other locations where we place our nuclear waste is of significant concern to many frontline communities and other communities as well. Then we also have to think about the transportation routes. When people are moving that waste, in many instances, our transportation routes have been built through communities of color and low-income communities. So if there is a train that derails or a truck or whatever it might be that's moving that waste, there are significant concerns that have to be addressed in that process. And Senator Sanders is probably saying, beyond the fact of where we place things, also in the transportation, we've got to be considerate of those communities that could be impacted by an accident. So all of that needs to be put into the mix. And that's why when we have these candidates who are talking about climate or they're talking about environmental issues, if we haven't had candidates also talking about environmental justice analysis and the policies and practices and activities, then we're going to leave these gaps in the process, and nuclear is one of those.
And Kate, could you talk about the venue for this town hall debate? It was held at Hudson Yards here in Manhattan, and also the fact that it was hosted by CNN. The fact that the media, corporate media, kind of control the kinds of questions that are asked in these debates. So both things, Hudson Yards and CNN hosting this town hall.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the debate was held at Hudson Yards, which was, the recipient of one of the largest giveaways from the city of New York, maybe in the city's history, and is sort of a haven for the wealthy, right? It's a luxury mall with a luxury housing development tacked onto it, and it's hard to think of a more stark example of what we might call eco-apartheid, right? This development that's sort of created to be insulated from the weather and insulated from most of New York City as well.
Although not exactly, because part of that giveaway was they extended the subway to go directly there.
Right. This subway, where we could have more functional bus lines, or we could invest, in building out the MTA between Brooklyn and Queens.
That's near empty when it goes there.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, I think this speaks to just how absurd it is to have this be the venue, for debate in a predominantly working class city, where people actually, have felt real climate impacts in the last several years. In Hurricane Sandy, why not, have the debate in the Rockaways, or have the town hall in the Rockaways, right? Which was hit by Sandy, continues to deal with its impacts, right? So I think, having it in this sort of sheltered place is pretty absurd. And just on the point about CNN, I think we saw a lot of preparation, and I think they should get some credit for putting on a seven-hour event. But I think we also saw, as I think Senator Warren rightly pushed back against, some really right-wing framings, sort of called right from the fossil fuel industry's playbook, to focus on things like straws, focus on things like should the government have a say in what kind of car you drive. These are all things that fossil fossil fuel companies and trade associations have said for decades to refocus away from the fact that, some 90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of emissions since the dawn of the industrial age, right? We know who the enemy is here, right? And it's not sort of the people who are, wanting a more convenient way to drink their coffee in the morning. It's these companies, and I think, there's very few candidates on that stage who rightly name that.
And of course, these Hudson Yards billionaire developer Stephen Ross was recently in the headlines. Longtime friend of Donald Trump, recently held a $100,000 plate fundraiser for him in the Hamptons. Mattias Lehman, where does this leave Green New Deal at this point? And what do you want to see these candidates questioned about in the next debate, even if it isn't exclusively a climate crisis debate? And do you think the DNC will relent with the tremendous pressure from many pushing for an official debate? This was, again, one-by-one candidates.
Right. So, well, let's start with Green New Deal. The Green New Deal has been talked about like it's a bill, right? Like there's this one small bill, and we just need to pass it, and then there we go, Green New Deal, awesome. But the name choice is very intentional. New Deal. The New Deal was not a bill. It was a series of plans rolled out over a long period of time aimed at a specific goal. So when we're talking about the Green New Deal, we're talking about a framework. And lots of bills are going to fall into that framework. Lots of regulations are going to fall into that framework. And so we can continue to talk about what's going to happen with the Green New Deal, but a lot of that, like you said, is going to come from pressure. It's going to come from pressure to shift to green energy. It's going to come from pressure for regulations on, even the things that they did talk about, like light bulbs. Yeah, that's going to be a part of the toolkit, but it's not the primary thing. But looking at this overall, because it's so many issues, it's just going to take constant pressure. And so we have seen this feedback loop of put in some pressure, get out of town hall, right? Sunrise, other activist groups. So now we need to figure out how to operationalize that, and that's what we're going to be doing going through 2019, through 2020, and all the way through to the end of this climate crisis, is continuing to put pressure. I think step one is the climate strike on September 20th. Sunrise is standing with a lot of other partners and young people all around the world, and we're going to walk out of our schools, we're going to walk out of our jobs, and we're going to say, hey, the adults in the room haven't been acting on climate change for decades. And so we're going to put pressure now because this is our future on the line, and we need to be a voice in that room, we need to be heard, and we need action. Two, there's a big election coming up, and I know, especially in primaries, a lot of presidential candidates think they don't have to worry too much about the youth vote. Millennials don't vote, Gen Z doesn't vote, the turnout's going to be low. That's going to be different this election. We are going to colleges and to high schools and to young people out of school, and we're making sure that they understand that registering in this primary and voting is the most important thing they can do for their future.
Mattias Lehman, I want to thank you for being with us. Sunrise Movement, Mustafa Ali, former EPA official, now with the National Wildlife Federation, and Kate Aronoff of The Intercept and Jacobin. When we come back, nearly 2 million people in the northeast state of Assam, India, are at risk of being rendered stateless after India effectively stripped them of citizenship. It's been described as the biggest exercise of disenfranchisement in human history. Stay with us.